For a long time now, I've been referring to millennials, and I think this would include Gen Z as well, as a lost generation. Now, the term lost generation, I believe, was coined by Hemingway, and it referred to those who came of age during and immediately after World War One. It was a group who was scarred both physically and emotionally from the horrors of World War One. A large proportion, compared to previous generations of the males, had died off. They had to face a social, cultural, and political order that had, in many parts of the West, collapsed or was in the middle of being deeply reformed or had lost any kind of belief in itself. And they didn't really have any kind of direction, and they weren't really sure where to go or what to do or anything of that sort. And I think that's very much the case with millennials, because they were born in the immediate aftermath of the ending of the Cold War and what's often called the end of history. And I think the Cold War, whether you think it was a fraud or not, did give purpose to a lot of people in both the West and the East, that there was this grand global metaphysical struggle that they were participating in, and it gave their lives meaning. It also saw the US and its various allies completely abandoning any sort of pragmatism or supporting any ideology that was anti-communist, and just jumping on full board with social liberalism in all its forms and imposing it on not just Western societies, but throughout the world. And I feel like beginning in the 90s to a certain extent, but it really accelerated during the 2000s and in the aftermath of Obama's election, this social revolution that sought to destroy whatever remaining place, identity, tradition, religion, the family, any of the things that civilization had previously been based on, were removed from society and demonized and damned. And so this gave birth to a generation that grew up without any clear ideological foe for the first time really since, I don't know, decades, maybe centuries. There was no real ideological opposition until Islamism came around. They didn't really have nationalism or identitarianism or religion or anything like that to kind of give their lives some sort of order and to provide them with some sort of path and way to go. Instead, really all they had was the media, which I think in many cases sold them a very unrealistic view of the world and gave them expectations that just didn't conform to reality. Said if you don't have this materialistic lifestyle, if you don't own this particular product, if you haven't done this particular thing, if your girlfriend isn't this hot, then you're a loser and your life isn't worth living. So I think the generation grew up with the ideas that certain material products and certain status symbols were really the only way to gauge success, and that was kind of the structure that they were brought into. So that's kind of the cultural, social aspect of it. I think public schools in particular became extremely abusive, and they've become even more so as time goes on, and are actively doing psychological damage to our kids. And we can talk about that some other time, but you get what I'm saying. So that's the cultural, social, and spiritual side of it. Then there's the economic side of it. And the economic side of it is generations are living a lot longer than they did previously. And this is combined with the dramatic fall in the birth rate. So the population's much older now than it's probably ever been. And because the older generation isn't really retiring and the population isn't really growing, so there's not the natural growing demand for labor, it's kind of resulted in the situation where most mid-level to senior positions have been held by the older generations, and there's kind of a surplus of labor, particularly a surplus of educated, skilled labor, and it's become very difficult for people, millennials or Gen Z, to get into any kind of entry-level jobs. And even if they can get into them, they have to be vastly overqualified because there's so much labor and the supply far outstrips the demand, the average wage is comparatively quite low, and it's going to take a very long time to get anywhere. And what makes the situation worse in a lot of countries is governments want to fill labor shortages not by retraining their citizens, but by bringing in immigrants who will do it for much cheaper than the native population. So they're increasing the labor supply further, and that has a downward pressure on wages and a downward pressure on employment for the native population. You also have stuff like automation and things like that, but that's kind of a secondary thing. Now, on top of that, you have massive increase in the cost of living, particularly driven by housing prices. So the scenario a lot of people in their 20s and 30s live in is they work at, if not Starbucks or a minimum wage job, at an entry-level job making maybe $50,000, $60,000 a year, depending on where they live. And their monthly rent for like a hole in the wall be something like $1,500, $2,000. If they want a one bedroom, that's going to be probably at least $2,000 in Toronto. And so the vast majority of their money goes to rent. If they're able to save any money, it's not a lot. A lot of the people also have irresponsible spending habits, so they'll spend it on alcohol or stuff. In a lot of cases, though, the cost of living and taxes are both so high that even if the person doesn't live a particularly extravagant lifestyle, they have very little disposable income. And so they're more or less at a subsistence level, and if something bad happens to them, they're just completely fucked. They have to move back in with their parents, or they have to take some sort of other dramatic action, because the cost of living has gone up much faster than wages have. So that's half of the economic pie. The other half is that millennials and Gen Z have been sold this bill of goods that there are good jobs out there. You just have to go to university. It doesn't matter what you get a degree in. And so an entire generation, or I guess 2 or 3 generations at this point, were just told to go to university. They didn't really tell them why they need to go to university or to go to university for anything in particular. And so they went. And in the case of Canadians, it's just people spent a couple of years of their lives. It's generally speaking fairly affordable to go to school. The interest on the loans isn't huge. There's loan forgiveness. There's a lot of different things to help out. So you could argue at the worst it's the waste of time, and it might take you a couple of years, maybe up to a decade, to pay back your loans. But in the United States, it's absurd the amount of money that school costs. But kids have been told, oh, you'll be able to pay it off. You'll get a good paying job like your parents did if you just get a degree in something. So these kids will get these loans that they'll never be able to pay off because they'll never get a job that pays enough to do it. The loans can't be dispatched during bankruptcy. And so they're debt slaves. So they're working their crappy job that doesn't pay very much. Most of their money goes to rent. The rest of the money goes to pay off their student loans. And the question is, like, what are they supposed to do then? Like, generally speaking, the idea is at that age, you want to start a family maybe, or buy a house. But that's just not financially possible for most people in that age group, because housing is so expensive and they still have to deal with student loans and all this other stuff. And people, especially those who want to be responsible, don't want to bring up a kid in an environment of total poverty. They want to have some stability in their lives, so they're not like constantly moving around, and they can provide their kid with the basics, or a bit above the basics of life. And so you have millennials and Gen Z who just don't get married. And I don't know how much of it is really the autism thing and how much of it is just the financial thing. So the overall picture you have is a generation that doesn't have any of the spiritual, political, or social supports that previous generations had, and really also aren't able to advance economically as well. So a lot of them just kind of give in to hedonism, to pornography, to drugs, to alcohol, to status signaling. It's why so many of them take medication. It's why so many of them commit suicide and shit like that. And the situation is just not getting any better. And I think COVID has made it exponentially worse. And I don't really know if there's an out for it. It's just something that's going to have to come to head eventually. Because if something can't go on forever, it has to stop. And I mean, the baby boomers have to retire at some point, right? Right? I mean, who even knows where we're headed at this point? But it's not looking good for millennials. It's not looking good for Zoomers either.